The House Education Committee chamber fell silent as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis straightened his navy tie, confident smile fading from his face. Representative Nancy Mace had just asked him a simple question about charter school funding in Florida, and he had dismissed it with his trademark combative tone. But now, as Mace slowly opened a thick binder labeled Florida Education Funds Donor Connections, DeSantis's jaw tightened visibly. What she was about to reveal would not only expose how millions in federal education dollars had been funneled to his biggest donors' charter school chains, but would trace a money trail leading directly back to his own family's financial interests. The cameras caught every second as one of America's most prominent governors realized he had just walked into a carefully prepared trap. The morning had begun differently for Ron DeSantis. He arrived at the Rayburn House office building with his usual entourage of advisors, press handlers, and Florida state officials. At 46, the governor had become one of the most recognizable politicians in America. His confrontational style, willingness to fight cultural battles, and carefully cultivated image as a conservative champion had made him a Republican superstar. After a presidential primary campaign that ultimately fell short, DeSantis had returned to Florida with his national ambitions still intact, positioning himself as a key figure in shaping the party's future direction. The hearing was supposed to be routine testimony about how states were implementing federal education programs. The Every Student Succeeds Act provided billions of dollars annually to states for various education initiatives, and Congress periodically called governors to discuss how those funds were being used. DeSantis had testified before congressional committees multiple times during his previous tenure in the House of Representatives. He knew the rhythms, understood the political theater, and had refined his ability to turn congressional hearings into media moments that energized his base. His preparation team had anticipated friendly questions from Republican members about school choice success stories and tougher inquiries from Democrats about equity and oversight. They had prepared talking points, statistics, and anecdotes about Florida students thriving in charter schools. What they had not adequately prepared for was a deep forensic investigation into where the money actually went and who benefited from it. Representative Nancy Mace sat in the third row of the committee dais, her blonde hair pulled back professionally, wearing a charcoal gray suit that projected seriousness and authority. At 47, the South Carolina Congresswoman had developed a reputation as one of the House's most thorough investigators. Her background in business and her instinct for following financial trails had made her particularly effective on the Education Committee, where billions of federal dollars flowed to states and school districts with often minimal oversight. Mace had been tracking Florida's charter school expansion for months. It started with a constituent complaint about a charter school that had opened with great fanfare, received millions in federal startup grants, and then closed abruptly after just 2 years, leaving students scrambling to find new schools. That single complaint led Mace's small investigative team down a complex path of corporate structures, political donations, and interconnected business relationships that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate how public money was being spent. The hearing room was full. C-SPAN cameras captured every angle. Education reporters from major newspapers filled the press section. DeSantis's testimony was considered newsworthy not just because of his prominence, but because education policy had become a central battleground in American politics. The debate over charter schools, school choice, parental rights, and curriculum had energized voters across the political spectrum, making any hearing on the topic inherently compelling. For the first hour, the proceedings unfolded predictably. Republican committee members praised DeSantis for his education reforms, citing improved test scores in some Florida districts and increased school choice options for parents. They asked softball questions that allowed him to deliver polished talking points about empowering families and breaking the monopoly of traditional public schools. DeSantis handled these questions with practiced ease, his responses flowing smoothly as he emphasized themes of freedom, choice, and results. He painted a picture of Florida as an education laboratory where innovative approaches were lifting students who had been failed by the traditional system. His passion seemed genuine, his statistics compelling, his vision inspiring to those who shared his educational philosophy. Democratic members were more critical, pressing him on accountability measures, questioning whether charter schools were actually performing better than traditional public schools, and raising concerns about segregation and equity. DeSantis deflected these challenges with a combination of data, personal anecdotes, and occasional combativeness that suggested his questioners were more interested in protecting a failing status quo than helping children. Then the chairman recognized Representative Nancy Mace for her 5 minutes of questioning. The energy in the room didn't change immediately. Mace was known as a moderate Republican who sometimes broke with her party, but she wasn't typically associated with the kind of confrontational questioning that produced viral moments. DeSantis seemed relaxed as she began. "Governor DeSantis, thank you for being here today," Mace started, her tone professional and courteous. "I want to focus on a specific aspect of Florida's charter school expansion. According to the federal data, Florida received approximately $830 million in federal charter school grants and related education funds over the past 4 years. That's a substantial investment. Can you walk the committee through how those funds were distributed?" DeSantis nodded, seeming pleased with the question. It allowed him to showcase his administration's work. "Certainly, Representative, those funds went to support the creation and expansion of high-quality charter schools across Florida. We have a rigorous application process that ensures only strong school operators with proven track records receive funding. The results speak for themselves. Florida's charter schools are among the highest performing in the nation." "I appreciate that overview," Mace replied calmly. "But I'm interested in something more specific. Of that $830 million, approximately $412 million went to just 9 charter school networks. That's roughly half the money going to less than 2% of the schools. Does that concentration concern you at all?" It was a reasonable question, the kind that could be answered with explanations about larger network capacity, economies of scale, or proven success records. But something in Mace's tone, or perhaps the specificity of her numbers, caused DeSantis's media-trained instincts to shift into defense mode. "Representative Mace, I think you're looking at this the wrong way," DeSantis responded, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Those larger networks serve thousands of students. They've demonstrated success over years of operation. It makes sense that proven operators would receive more funding than startups with no track record. That's just good stewardship of taxpayer dollars." "Good stewardship," Mace repeated, as if testing the phrase. "Let me ask you about one of those networks specifically. Sunshine Academy operates 42 schools across Florida and received $87 million in federal funds during your administration. Are you familiar with that organization?" "Of course," DeSantis replied. "Sunshine Academy is one of our success stories. They serve predominantly low-income students and have consistently strong academic results." "And are you familiar with who owns Sunshine Academy?" Mace asked, her voice still calm but with an undertone that made several people in the room sit up slightly straighter. "It's operated by a board of directors, like most charter networks," DeSantis said, his response careful but confident. "I don't involve myself in the corporate structure of individual schools. The board is really more of an advisory body," Mace corrected gently. "The actual ownership structure is interesting. Sunshine Academy is wholly owned by a company called Educational Ventures Holdings, which is registered in Delaware, and Educational Ventures Holdings is primarily owned by 3 individuals: Richard Corcoran, your former education commissioner; Sal Muzo, who runs the James Madison Institute, one of your biggest supporting think tanks; and Maury Hosseini, who has donated over $5 million to your political campaigns." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Reporters began typing more quickly. Several Democratic committee members leaned forward with visible interest. DeSantis's communications director, seated in the front row behind him, was suddenly typing urgently on her phone. "Representative, what you're describing is not unusual," DeSantis responded, his tone becoming more defensive. "Successful education leaders often invest in charter school operations. That's how school choice works. Private sector expertise improving public education." "I understand that argument," Mace acknowledged. "But here's what concerns me. Mr. Corcoran was your education commissioner when the decision was made to award Sunshine Academy its largest federal grant, $42 million for a statewide expansion. He then resigned from your administration and became chairman of Educational Ventures Holdings 6 months later. That timeline raises questions about whether his decisions as a public official were influenced by his future private business interests." DeSantis's jaw tightened. "Representative, Commissioner Corcoran served with distinction and followed all ethics guidelines. What you're suggesting is offensive and without foundation. Is it without foundation? Mace asked, reaching for the thick binder that had been sitting closed in front of her throughout the hearing. Because I've spent the last 3 months reviewing documents, and I've found some things I think the American people need to understand about how their education tax dollars are being spent in Florida. She opened the binder slowly, deliberately, the way a prosecutor might open a case file in front of a jury. The label on the binder's cover was clearly visible to the cameras: Florida Education Funds Donor Connections. DeSantis's confident posture began to shift. His shoulders tensed slightly. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table, now gripped its edge. Let's start with the 9 charter networks that received the bulk of federal funding, Mace said, pulling out the first document. I have here a chart showing the ownership structure of each network, the amounts they received, and their political donation histories. Nancy Mace placed the chart on the document camera, and it appeared on screens throughout the hearing room. It was a meticulously prepared visual representation showing 9 charter school networks arranged in columns, with lines connecting them to corporate entities, political donors, and ultimately to Ron DeSantis's campaign committees and allied political organizations. The web of connections was complex but comprehensible, designed to show patterns that might be missed when examining individual transactions in isolation. What you're looking at, Mace explained to the committee and the cameras, is $412 million in federal education funding distributed to 9 charter school networks over 4 years. Every one of these networks is owned or controlled by major donors to Governor DeSantis's political operation. Collectively, these 9 network owners and their associated entities have contributed over $18 million to the governor's campaigns, his PACs, and aligned political organizations. The numbers hung in the air, their implications clear even before Mace spelled them out. Republican committee members shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the typical partisan divide over education philosophy. This was about whether public money had been distributed based on merit or political connections. DeSantis attempted to regain control of the narrative. Representative, you're drawing connections that don't exist. These are successful education organizations that happen to be run by people who share my vision for education reform. Of course, they support my campaigns. They believe in school choice just as I do. That doesn't mean funding decisions were based on donations. Doesn't it? Mace responded, her tone sharpening slightly. Let me walk you through a specific timeline. In March 2022, Maury Hussaini, the real estate developer I mentioned earlier, donated $800,000 to your PAC. 6 weeks later, Sunshine Academy, in which Mr. Hussaini is a principal investor, received a $42 million federal grant approval from your Department of Education. 3 months after that, Mr. Hussaini donated another $600,000. Does that timeline concern you at all, Governor? Correlation is not causation. DeSantis replied, using a phrase his team had clearly prepared for such inquiries. Grant decisions are made by professional staff based on application quality and statutory criteria. I don't personally approve individual grants. You're right that you don't personally sign off on every grant. Mace acknowledged, but you do appoint the people who oversee the process. And you did sign an executive order in 2021 creating a fast-track approval process for charter school grants from proven operators. That order effectively allowed your education commissioner to bypass normal review procedures for networks deemed successful. Who determined which operators were proven? The question hung unanswered for a moment as DeSantis consulted quietly with his attorney. The hesitation was telling. Every second of silence made it appear as though he was searching for a safe answer rather than simply stating the truth. That determination was made using objective metrics. DeSantis finally said, test scores, graduation rates, financial stability, the same criteria any reasonable person would use. Objective metrics. Mace repeated. Let me share some other metrics with the committee. She pulled out another document, this one appearing to be a detailed financial analysis. Of the 9 charter networks that received the bulk of federal funding, 6 had financial irregularities flagged by state auditors prior to receiving their largest grants. 2 had been cited for misuse of state funds. 1 was operating under a corrective action plan due to academic underperformance. Yet all 9 received fast-track approval under your executive order. She paused to let that information sink in before continuing. The networks that didn't receive significant funding, many of them had stronger academic records, better financial management, and no history of compliance issues. The difference wasn't performance, Governor. The difference was political connections. The hearing room was now completely focused on the exchange. The usual side conversations had stopped. Even the most partisan Republican members were listening intently, unable to simply dismiss the evidence Mace was presenting. This wasn't about education philosophy or policy disagreements. This was about documented financial relationships and decision-making patterns that appeared to prioritize political loyalty over educational merit. DeSantis's chief of staff was now in animated conversation with the governor's legal counsel. Florida state officials seated behind DeSantis looked increasingly concerned. The image they had come to project of a successful, well-run state government led by an effective executive was being systematically dismantled by a single congresswoman with a binder full of documents. Representative Mace, DeSantis said, his voice taking on the aggressive edge that his supporters admired and his critics found combative. What you're engaged in here is a political hit job. You're taking normal business relationships and political support and trying to twist them into some kind of corruption narrative. The people of Florida elected me to reform education, and that's exactly what I've done. If successful charter school operators support my campaigns because they appreciate my policies, that's democracy, not corruption. It was a calculated gamble, shift from defense to offense, paint Mace as the partisan actor, and appeal to the Republican members of the committee to defend him against Democratic attacks. There was just one problem. Nancy Mace was a Republican, and her reputation for thoroughness meant that dismissing her as partisan would be harder than usual. Governor, I'm not here to question your education philosophy, Mace replied evenly. I'm here to examine whether federal taxpayer money was distributed appropriately. And the evidence suggests it wasn't. She reached into her binder again, this time pulling out what appeared to be email printouts. I want to share with the committee some communications we obtained through public records requests. These are emails between officials in your Department of Education discussing charter school grant applications. Mace held up the first email, dated October 2021. This email is from the director of your Office of Charter Schools to Commissioner Corcoran. It discusses an application from a small charter network in Jacksonville that had strong academic results but limited political connections. The director writes, and I quote, "Application is solid, meets all criteria, recommend approval for $2.1 million. However, headquarters flagged this as not priority tier. The application was denied." She picked up another email. This one, dated 2 weeks later, discusses Sunshine Academy's application for $42 million. The same director writes, application has some financial concerns raised by review team, however, per our conversation, this is Tier 1 priority. Recommend expedited approval. It was approved within 10 days. The pattern was damning. Priority Tier 1 for politically connected networks, even those with problems. No priority status for networks without connections, even those with strong records. The emails provided direct evidence that political considerations were driving funding decisions. Those emails are being taken out of context, DeSantis insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Priority tier referred to serving areas of greatest need, not political connections. Did it? Mace asked. Because I have 17 more emails that use the same terminology, and in every case, the priority tier 1 designation corresponds with networks owned by your major donors. Every single time, Governor. She spread several more email printouts on the table in front of her, their highlighted sections visible even from a distance. The visual impact was significant. This wasn't one or two questionable decisions, but a systematic pattern documented across dozens of communications. A Democratic committee member raised her hand. Mr. Chairman, I move that we subpoena all communications related to charter school funding decisions during Governor DeSantis's administration. What we're hearing raises serious questions about misuse of federal funds. Before the chairman could respond, Mace interjected, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to finish my questioning first. Because there's one more element of this story that I think is particularly important for the public to understand. The chairman nodded. The representative may continue. Mace pulled out a different type of document from her binder, this one appearing to be corporate registration paperwork. Governor DeSantis, I want to ask you about a company called Educational Excellence LLC. Are you familiar with it? DeSantis paused, a flicker of something concern. Recognition, crossing his face before he composed himself. I'd need to see more specific information. There are many education-related companies operating in Florida. Let me provide some specifics, Mace said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested this was the most significant revelation yet. Educational Excellence LLC was registered in Florida in January 2020, just a few months after you began your term as governor. According to corporate filings, it provides consulting services to charter school operators. Over the past 4 years, it has received approximately $8 million in fees from various charter school networks in Florida. She paused deliberately before continuing. Now, what's interesting about Educational Excellence LLC is its ownership structure. It's held by a trust, the Sunshine Family Trust, registered in South Dakota, where trust ownership information is particularly opaque. However, we were able to obtain some documentation through a confidential source. Mace held up another document, this one with sections clearly highlighted. According to these trust documents, the Sunshine Family Trust has 4 beneficiaries. 3 of them are shell entities that we're still working to identify. But the 4th beneficiary is listed as Casey B. DeSantis. The hearing room exploded. Reporters began shouting questions. Democratic committee members demanded order while expressing shock. Republican members looked stunned. DeSantis's entire team went into visible crisis mode, huddling together in frantic whispered conversation. Casey DeSantis was Ron DeSantis's wife, Florida's First Lady, a former television news anchor who had become increasingly prominent in her husband's political operation. If what Mace was suggesting was true, that a company receiving millions from charter schools that themselves received federal funding was paying money into a trust that benefited the governor's wife, it represented a potential corruption scandal of significant magnitude. That's a lie. DeSantis's voice cut through the chaos, louder and angrier than any previous response. My wife has nothing to do with charter school consulting. This is a complete fabrication. Governor, I'm going to enter these trust documents into the congressional record, Mace said calmly, seemingly unmoved by his outburst. They were provided by a source within Florida's corporate registration office and have been authenticated by independent document examiners. If they're fraudulent, you're welcome to prove that. But given their provenance and authentication, I'm confident they're genuine. She turned to address the full committee. Chairman, what we have here is a systematic pattern of federal education funds being directed to politically connected charter school operators, who then paid consulting fees to a company that benefited the governor's family. This isn't about education philosophy or school choice. This is about public corruption using children's education funding as a vehicle for personal enrichment. The chairman's gavel came down repeatedly, sharp cracks that barely managed to restore order to the chaotic hearing room. Ron DeSantis sat rigid in his chair, his face flushed with anger, his carefully cultivated image of control completely shattered. His legal team was in full crisis management mode, passing notes, making urgent phone calls, and clearly trying to figure out how to contain a scandal that was already spiraling beyond their control. Nancy Mace remained composed, almost serene, as the chaos swirled around her. She had spent months preparing for this moment, anticipating every possible response, every deflection, every attack. She knew that confronting someone as politically powerful as Ron DeSantis required not just courage but meticulous preparation. One factual error, one overstated claim, and the entire narrative could collapse, making her the story instead of the governor's apparent corruption. Mr. Chairman, Mace continued once relative quiet had been restored. I want to be clear about what these documents show. Over a 4-year period, federal education funds intended for Florida students were systematically directed to charter school networks owned by the governor's political donors. Those networks then paid consulting fees to a company that benefited the governor's family trust. This isn't complicated. It's a kickback scheme using children's education as cover. The word kickback landed like a bomb. It was the first time Mace had used such direct language, and it carried serious legal implications. Federal law prohibited using one's official position for personal financial gain. If what Mace was describing was accurate, it could potentially constitute multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud, honest services fraud, and potentially even racketeering. DeSantis's attorney immediately objected. Mr. Chairman, the representative is making serious criminal accusations without providing Governor DeSantis an opportunity to review these so-called documents or respond appropriately. This is trial by ambush, and it's fundamentally unfair. The chairman, a Democrat who had been quietly delighted by the direction the hearing had taken, nonetheless recognized the legitimate procedural concern. Representative Mace, these are serious allegations. Can you provide Governor DeSantis with copies of the documents you're referencing? Absolutely, Mace replied. My staff is distributing packets to all committee members and to the governor's team right now. Everything I've referenced today will be part of the public record. I have nothing to hide. As thick manila envelopes were distributed around the committee room, reporters craned to see their contents. The pause in questioning allowed the full weight of what had been revealed to settle over the hearing. This wasn't just another partisan food fight, this was documented evidence of potential corruption at the highest levels of one of America's largest state governments. DeSantis huddled with his legal team, rapidly flipping through the documents Mace had provided. His face went through several expressions: anger, confusion, calculation. Several times he pointed at specific pages and asked questions of his attorneys, who could only shake their heads or shrug. Whatever they had prepared for, it wasn't this level of detailed documentary evidence. Governor DeSantis, Mace said, drawing his attention back to the hearing, I want to give you an opportunity to explain these connections. Let's start with the simplest question. Did you know that Educational Excellence LLC was paying money into a trust that benefits your wife? It was a clever question. If DeSantis said yes, he was admitting knowledge of the arrangement. If he said no, he was either admitting to being unaware of his family's finances or worse, lying about it. Either answer created problems. My family's financial arrangements are private. DeSantis finally responded, his voice tight. They're managed by professionals, and all disclosures required by Florida law have been made. I don't involve myself in the day-to-day details. I understand that position, Mace replied. But you're not just any private citizen, Governor. You're a public official who makes decisions about distributing billions of dollars in public funds. The American people have a right to know if you're personally benefiting from those decisions. She pulled out yet another document, the seemingly endless supply in her binder suggesting months of investigative work. Let me ask about a specific transaction. In June 2023, Educational Excellence LLC received a payment of $450,000 from Sunshine Academy for strategic consulting services. That same month, your Department of Education approved a $20 million expansion grant for Sunshine Academy. 1 week later, the Sunshine Family Trust purchased a vacation home in the Florida Keys valued at $1.2 million. The timing seems remarkably convenient. The connection was damning, even allowing for the possibility of coincidence. The timeline suggested a clear pattern. Charter schools received state approval for federal funds. They paid consulting fees to a company connected to the governor's family, and that money was then used for luxury purchases. It was the kind of corruption story that could end careers and potentially lead to criminal prosecution. Representative Mace, DeSantis said, his voice rising with indignation, "You're engaged in a conspiracy theory based on coincidental timing. My wife is successful in her own right. She had a television career before we were married. We have legitimate income sources beyond my government salary. Your suggestion that we're somehow stealing from school children is outrageous and defamatory. Then explain the documents." Mace shot back, her composure finally showing a crack of emotion. Explain why every charter network that paid Educational Excellence LLC received expedited grant approval. Explain why networks without political connections were denied funding even when they had better academic records. Explain why your education commissioner resigned to take a leadership role in a company that received $87 million in federal grants that he personally approved. She stood up slightly, leaning forward over her microphone. Governor, I'm a Republican, just like you. I believe in school choice. I support charter schools when they're operated with integrity. But what you've created in Florida isn't school choice, it's a pay-to-play system where federal education dollars are treated as a political slush fund to reward donors and enrich your family. The hearing room had gone completely silent. Every camera was focused on the exchange. This had transcended partisan politics and become something more fundamental. A question of basic honesty and integrity in government. A senior Republican committee member, a longtime DeSantis supporter, cleared his throat. Governor, I think Representative Mace has raised legitimate concerns that deserve thorough answers. I'd like to suggest we recess for 30 minutes to allow you and your team to review the documents and prepare a comprehensive response. It was a lifeline, an attempt to give DeSantis time to regroup and potentially salvage the situation. But the damage was already done. The documents were now public. Reporters were already filing stories. The connection between political donations, federal funding, and the governor's family finances was now part of the permanent record. DeSantis consulted briefly with his team before responding. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the member's suggestion, but I think it's important to respond now. The American people are watching, and they deserve immediate answers, not calculated responses developed by lawyers during a recess. It was a bold decision, driven either by genuine confidence that he could explain away the connections, or by the political calculation that appearing to hide would be worse than whatever answers he could provide. He straightened in his chair, adjusted his tie, and began his response. Let me be absolutely clear, DeSantis stated, his voice firm. I have never made a single funding decision based on political contributions. Every charter school that received federal grants in Florida met the statutory criteria for approval. The suggestion that I personally benefited from these decisions is false. My financial disclosures, which are public record, show all of our income sources and investments. Those disclosures don't include trust beneficiaries. Mace interjected. South Dakota trust law specifically allows for non-disclosure of beneficiary information. That's why wealthy people and politicians use South Dakota trusts to hide assets from public scrutiny. My family has done nothing wrong, DeSantis insisted. Educational Excellence LLC is a legitimate consulting company that provides real services to education organizations. The fact that some of their clients also received state grants is not evidence of wrongdoing. It's evidence that successful charter operators seek out good consulting services. What services? Mace pressed. I've reviewed Educational Excellence LLC's corporate filings. They have no employees listed, no office address beyond a registered agent, no website, no public track record of any consulting work. It's a shell company, Governor, a vehicle for moving money from charter schools that received federal grants into your family's trust. The exchange continued for another 20 minutes, with DeSantis attempting to defend the arrangements and Mace systematically dismantling each explanation with additional documents and evidence. By the time the chairman finally adjourned the hearing, it was clear to everyone in the room that Ron DeSantis had suffered a devastating political blow. The immediate aftermath was explosive. Within minutes, DeSantis' corruption was trending nationally on social media. News networks broke into regular programming to cover the hearing. Political commentators from across the spectrum struggled to spin what had become an apparently clear-cut case of corruption. Conservative outlets initially tried to defend DeSantis, arguing that Mace had ambushed him with unverified documents. But as reporters began independently confirming the trust documents, the corporate relationships, and the timeline of grants and payments, even friendly media couldn't sustain the defense. By evening, several prominent conservative commentators were calling for DeSantis to provide more detailed explanations. The White House released a carefully worded statement expressing concern about the allegations and calling for a full investigation. The Department of Education announced it would review all federal charter school grants awarded to Florida during DeSantis' tenure. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit, based in Miami, reportedly began preliminary inquiries into whether federal crimes had been committed. In Florida, the political earthquake was even more dramatic. Several Republican state legislators who had been loyal DeSantis supporters issued statements calling for transparency and full disclosure of all financial relationships. The Democratic minority leader called for a special legislative session to investigate the charter school funding process. Editorial boards of major Florida newspapers, including some that had endorsed DeSantis in past elections, published scathing critiques calling for his resignation. Nancy Mace conducted limited media appearances in the days following the hearing, maintaining her professional, facts-focused approach. In an interview with 60 Minutes, she was asked whether she believed DeSantis should resign. "That's not my decision to make," Mace replied carefully. "But I believe the American people have a right to know when their tax dollars are being misused. We sent $830 million in federal education funding to Florida to help students. If even a fraction of that money was diverted to enrich politically connected individuals and the governor's family, that's a betrayal of public trust that demands accountability." The interview was viewed by millions, with many praising Mace's measured approach. She had avoided partisan rhetoric, stuck to documented evidence, and allowed the facts to speak for themselves. It was a masterclass in effective congressional oversight. Over the following weeks, the investigations multiplied. A grand jury in Florida's Northern District began hearing evidence. The House Committee on Education voted to issue subpoenas for additional documents from the Florida Department of Education. Several charter school executives facing potential legal jeopardy began cooperating with investigators and providing information about pressure they faced to hire specific consulting firms and make political contributions. Ron DeSantis attempted to control the damage, giving a primetime address from the Florida governor's mansion in which he denied any wrongdoing and accused partisan opponents of trying to destroy him politically. But the speech fell flat. The documents were too comprehensive, the timeline too clear, the connections too obvious. Public opinion polls showed his approval rating in Florida dropping by 20 points in just 2 weeks. National polls showed him falling to single digits in hypothetical 2028 presidential primary matchups. 3 months after the hearing, federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against Richard Corcoran, DeSantis's former education commissioner, alleging honest services fraud and wire fraud in connection with the charter school grant approval process. Corcoran immediately began cooperation negotiations with prosecutors, a development that sent shockwaves through DeSantis's political operation. The investigation's scope continued to expand, eventually encompassing not just charter school funding, but other areas of Florida state government, where similar patterns of donations, followed by favorable decisions, could be identified. What had begun as Nancy Mace's investigation into education funding had metastasized into the most comprehensive public corruption probe in Florida's modern history. Ron DeSantis, once considered a future presidential contender and one of the Republican Party's brightest stars, saw his political career effectively ended. He completed his term as governor but announced he would not seek re-election. Several publishers canceled book deals. Speaking fees evaporated. The carefully constructed image of the effective conservative reformer had been replaced by the reality of a politician who had allegedly used his office to enrich his family and reward political supporters. For Nancy Mace, the hearing represented a defining moment that elevated her national profile while establishing her credentials as a serious investigator willing to hold her own party accountable. She received invitations to speak at universities, was interviewed by major publications, and saw her influence within Congress grow substantially. The broader impact on American politics was significant. The hearing demonstrated that thorough investigation and documented evidence could still hold powerful figures accountable, even in an era of partisan division. It renewed focus on the need for stronger ethics enforcement and financial disclosure requirements for public officials. Several states passed laws requiring more transparency and trust beneficiary information for elected officials. 2 years after the hearing, a comprehensive book on the scandal became a bestseller, detailing how federal education money had been systematically diverted through political networks. The author, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, credited Nancy Mace's hearing as the breakthrough that made all subsequent investigations possible. What Mace did, the journalist wrote, was demonstrate that patient, thorough investigation still matters. In an age of hot takes and viral outrage, she showed that carefully documented evidence, methodically presented, remains the most powerful tool for accountability. She didn't just expose Ron DeSantis, she reminded us what real oversight looks like. The hearing became required viewing in journalism schools, law schools, and public policy programs as an example of effective congressional investigation. Students analyzed Mace's preparation, her questioning strategy, her use of documents, and her ability to maintain composure while delivering devastating revelations. The marble halls of the Rayburn House office building had witnessed countless hearings over the decades, but few as consequential as the day Nancy Mace opened a binder labeled Florida Education Fund since Donor Connections and systematically exposed how federal money intended for students had been diverted to political cronies and potentially to a governor's family trust. It was a reminder that corruption, when confronted with evidence and courage, cannot survive in the light of public scrutiny. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth political investigations. Hit the notification bell to never miss the moments that truly matter in holding power accountable.